The rancher hadn't laughed since his daughter died. She baked her favorite cake. The cake was wrong. I knew it the second I walked in. The smell hit me before I even got the door all the way open, brown sugar and something underneath it. The warm char of a pan going just a minute too long, and my legs just stopped working. Right there in the doorway of my own kitchen, January cold pouring in behind me, boots still full of mud from the east pasture fence I've been trying to keep upright for 3 weeks running. Louisa was at my stove. She didn't turn around. She said, "Close the door, Mr. Briggs, you're letting the warmth out." The same flat way she said most things, like she wasn't in anybody else's house doing a thing nobody'd asked her to do. I closed the door. Stood there with my hat in my hand. She had a dish towel tucked into the waistband of her jeans and a wooden spoon I recognized, the one with the crack running up the handle that Nora had kept meaning to throw away and never did. 22 years Nora used that spoon. I'd put it in the drawer after the funeral and not taken it out since. That was 4 years ago. Louisa set the spoon down on the lip of the pan and finally looked at me over her shoulder. Dark eyes steady. The way she looked at things you never felt examined, just seen. "Sit," she said. I sat. I need to back up some. 4 years is a long time to be quiet inside a house. After Nora, I'd learned to run things alone, the cooking, the cleaning, the basic machinery of a life, and I'd gotten competent at it, if not comfortable. You can get used to a lot if you have enough work to fill the daylight and enough tired at night to fall asleep before you think too much. I had the land. I had Dov, who'd worked the cattle side for going on 8 years, and who was good company in the way working men are good company, which is to say he didn't require much talking. I had Mrs. Echeverria coming twice a week. I had the routine of it, and that was sufficient. Then Claire died, and even the routine stopped meaning anything for a while. She'd gone to see a college friend in Albuquerque. I remember that Friday she left, the way she'd hug me in the yard before she got in her car, holding on an extra beat the way she sometimes did, like she'd decided something at the last minute. The road back was a state highway with a long stretch of nothing and then a curve, and the other driver had come around that curve in the wrong lane and Claire's car had gone into the guardrail. She lived about 40 minutes after that. I wasn't there. Nobody I knew was there. A highway patrolman called at about 8 that evening. I remember I was in the barn, checking on a mare I thought might be coming down with something. I remember the patrolman's voice very clearly, careful and direct, the voice of a man who'd had to make this call before and knew there was no good way to do it. I remember going very still in the stall, and the mare turning her head and looking at me and thinking, all right then. Like something in me had been waiting for it to get bad again, and now it had, and there was a kind of grim familiarity to it. That night I went inside and sat at the kitchen table for a long time, without turning on any lights. After that, days. Dov kept the cattle operation running without being asked. Mrs. Echeverria came more frequently, left more food, did not say much. People from town came and offered things, their faces arranged into expressions I knew well from when Nora passed. I thanked them and they went away and the house got quiet again, and after a week or two it was just me and the work and the familiar shape of absence. What I did not expect was how permanent the quiet was going to feel. With Nora there had been Claire. Claire had been only 23 when her mother died, young enough to be angry about it and old enough to know she couldn't show me that anger because I had enough of my own. She'd driven out from Flagstaff most weekends that first year, and we'd done the work of grief side by side, not talking about it constantly but present for each other, filling the house with ordinary things. Cooking, watching the weather, walking the fence lines. She was good company, my daughter. She had her mother's quick mind and her own stubborn streak, and she would pick a fight with you over something small just to have the energy of it if she thought you'd been too quiet too long. After Claire was gone, there was no one like that. No one to make ordinary noise in the house. No one who had known Nora and loved her and could say her name like it was an ordinary word. I put the wooden spoon in the drawer. I stopped making anything that required more than one pot. I ate a lot of cold things. Dov noticed but didn't say anything. He was smart about what to leave alone. Sometimes at the end of a long day, I'd sit on the porch and he'd come and sit, too, and we'd watch the sun go down over the west ridge and not say a word, and that was its own kind of company, I suppose. But it was also the kind of company that leaves when the light goes. The days went by, the ranch ran, I was not unhappy. I want to be clear about that, I've been asked, and I know what unhappy looks like, and it wasn't that. What it was still. The way a range goes still in a long drought, when there's nothing wrong exactly. The ground is solid underfoot, but nothing is growing either, and you stop expecting it to. She came onto the Harker place in September. I didn't know much about her when she arrived. Ray Harker's nephew had inherited the property when Ray passed, and the nephew had no use for land in the middle of nowhere. He was some kind of software engineer in Denver, so he'd sold it to a woman from Wyoming that nobody in Calhoun County had met or heard of. People at the feed store talked about it. A woman ranching alone wasn't unusual, but she hadn't introduced herself around, hadn't come into town for the kind of social engagements new people are expected to attend, and the silence of her arrival was interesting to people who don't have much that's interesting. Her name was Louisa Roan Feather. I found that out from Dov, who'd found it out from the woman at the county assessor's office. The Roan Feather part was her mother's family, Cheyenne, out of Montana originally, though her mother had come south decades before and married a ranch hand from Cashalong County, Wyoming, and Louisa had grown up between two worlds in the way that some people do, quietly and without making it a performance. She came over the third week of October. I was replacing a section of board fence along the south side of the equipment shed when I saw her truck coming up the drive, a gray Ford, 10 years old at least, hauling an empty stock trailer. She parked and got out and walked over to me the same way you'd walk across your own yard, no hesitation in it. She said she was the new owner of the Harker property. I said I figured. She said her fence line along the north draw was showing some rot on the posts, and she planned to pull and restring that section before winter, but she'd looked at the deed and wasn't entirely confident where the property boundary sat, and she'd rather know before she started pulling her own posts in case some of them were technically mine, and I had a preference about what happened to them. That was the whole of the introduction. No pleasantries about being pleased to meet me, no curiosity about how long I'd been here, no comment on the property or the weather. She had a practical problem, and she was bringing it to the relevant party in a direct manner. I put down the board I was holding and went with her. We drove her truck up to the north draw and found the survey stakes, and she was right. They were off by about 4 feet in her favor, which meant several of her posts were actually on my side of the line. I told her it didn't matter much to me. The stakes were old and likely wrong, but if she wanted to run it correctly, we could set new ones at the proper mark and she could restring from there. She said she'd prefer to do it right. We restrung her side that afternoon, both of us working. She knew how to hold tension on a wire without instruction, which is not as common as it should be. She didn't fill the silence with talk. When she needed to tell me something, she did. Otherwise, we just worked. By the time we were done, the sun was already low and the temperature had dropped, and we walked back to her truck with our breath showing. She said thank you. I said don't mention it. She drove back toward her property and I walked home. I thought about that afternoon more than made sense in the days after. Not about her exactly. More about the quality of the silence between us, which had been a working silence, a shared silence, and which I had not noticed I was missing until I felt it again. November, she came over to borrow a come-along. Hers had snapped a cable trying to pull a fence post that had gone halfway to China, she said. I lent her mine. She brought it back 3 days later and left it on the porch with a note that said, "Working fine now. Thank you." December, her water line froze. She called and asked if I had a heat gun she could borrow. I had one and I went over with it myself. because a heat gun applied wrong to a frozen pipe can blow a fitting or, in a real bad case, start a fire inside a wall if there's insulation tight against the pipe. She didn't argue when I came in, instead of just handing the gun over the threshold, which told me she'd had enough experience with things to know when a person had a legitimate reason for offering hands-on help. It was a straightforward frozen section, copper pipe along the north exterior wall of her well house. We got it thawed in about 20 minutes. While we were working, she told me where she'd put the shutoff, where the main line ran from the well, what the pressure had read before the freeze. She'd already figured out most of what I'd want to know without being asked. After we went inside and she poured coffee without offering me the choice. I drank it standing at her kitchen counter the way you do when you're not sure if you're staying. She sat at her table. The kitchen was spare but functional. She'd arranged things the way someone arranges a place they intend to keep, not a temporary setup. There was a photograph on the windowsill above the sink. A boy of about 12 on a paint horse squinting into the sun. Good seat on the horse, I noticed. Relaxed and natural. I looked at it long enough that she said, "My son, Marcus. He's with his father most of the time." I nodded. She didn't add anything and I didn't ask. We talked about the winter, the range conditions, whether the hay prices were going to hold into spring, or whether the drought pressure up north was going to push them higher than anyone could comfortably absorb. She had opinions on all of it that were neither simple nor borrowed. She'd been paying attention to conditions and markets, and she could walk through her reasoning, which I respected. I left after maybe 40 minutes. On the drive home, I realized I had not talked about anything other than my own operation and my own worries in, I couldn't say how long. I talked to Dov, but Dov and I talked about the work. I talked to Mrs. Echeverria, but that was courtesy, the kind of talk you do to be decent to someone you see regularly. This had been different. This had been two people comparing what they knew and thinking out loud together. It stayed with me. January, I drove to town for feed, and there, she was in the parking lot of the hardware store with a box of wire staples under her arm. We walked out at the same time and stopped in the cold, and ended up talking for a while about a drainage problem on her east section that was similar to something I'd dealt with 2 years back. I told her what I'd found, which was that the grade of the terrain was collecting water at the base of the posts and rotting them from below, and the fix wasn't the posts themselves but the grade. She said she'd look at that. She looked like she was already thinking about where the low spots were. Then she said she was going to the diner for lunch. Said it the way she said everything, without preamble or ceremony. She was going, did I want to come? Like she'd noticed it was around noon and I was presumably also in the position of needing lunch. I went. We sat in a booth by the window, the old kind with the cracked vinyl patched with electrical tape, and she had the chicken soup, and I had what I always had, the roast beef on white, and we talked. More than we'd talked before. She told me about the ranch she'd had in Wyoming, a small cow-calf operation in Carbon County that she'd run with her ex-husband for almost a decade before it unraveled. A couple of bad drought years, and then the marriage going. She said it without bitterness, just the way you'd give someone directions to a place that had turned out to be a dead end. She'd learned what she'd learned from it and come south. I told her about the early years on this ranch. Before Nora got sick, when Claire was small, when we had more animals than sense, and not enough money to cover everything, and somehow none of that mattered much because there was noise in the house all the time, and the work had a point that was obvious every day. I don't know why I told her that. I don't think I'd talked about those years out loud since Nora went. She listened the way she did everything. She gave you her full attention, and she didn't try to contribute more than what the moment needed. We drove back in separate trucks. I sat in my kitchen that evening and ate Mrs. Echeverria's enchilada casserole cold out of the container, and thought about the fact that I had just eaten a hot meal at a table with another person for the first time in. I tried to count it up. Claire had come for Christmas the year before she died. That was almost 4 years ago. 4 years of eating alone. I hadn't thought about it in those terms before. It was just what was. February, she called about a horse trailer stuck in a snow rut behind her barn. I went over with the pickup and logging chains and spent about 2 hours in the dark getting it free. The cold that day was the serious kind, dry and still, and by the time we had the trailer out, we were both working with stiff fingers and there was ice on my beard. She'd been out there in it the same as me, doing whatever needed doing without complaint or commentary. We went inside and she made tea. I don't drink tea as a rule, but I wrapped my hands around the mug and it was hot and that was sufficient. We sat at her table and she told me Marcus was coming to visit in the spring. She said it offhandedly and then was quiet for a moment, and I could see something moving behind that, so I asked. She said she was looking forward to it and nervous about it both. I asked, why nervous? She looked at her tea and said because she'd moved again. She'd had to move before the Wyoming place, and before that one moved further back that she didn't elaborate on, and Marcus had been through all of it, and he was tired of it. He was 16 and he needed something to stay still, and she understood that, but she was also the one who'd had to make the decisions that didn't stay still, and the two of those things were hard to hold together. I asked her if she thought this place would stick. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I think so. I think this might be the last time. She said it carefully, like she'd thought about saying it and wasn't sure and then decided to anyway. I said, what makes you think so? She thought about that. I don't know yet, she said. It's a feeling, something about the land, something about, she stopped, looked at her tea again, something about the neighbors being decent. She said it flat, the way she said everything, without looking at me while she said it, and I felt it land somewhere in my chest and didn't say anything in return because I didn't have anything I was confident about saying. I drove home in the dark thinking about that word, decent. When was the last time somebody had called me something? March, she started coming over. Not because she needed something. She'd come in the late afternoon, usually, sometimes with something in her hands, a jar of plum jam she'd put up, a book she'd finished, once a piece of used tack from the sale barn that she thought might fit my bay, and she'd put the thing on the table and we'd sit and talk until it got dark. Dov noticed. He came into the kitchen one morning and Louisa was there, and he said good morning to her the same as he would have to me and then went about getting coffee, and when she left he looked at me over his mug and said, she seems all right, which from Dov was roughly the equivalent of a parade. We played cribbage. She was good at it, she remembered what you'd played, and she didn't let sentimentality affect her counting, and she'd take a point off you without apology if you miscounted and put it wrong. I liked that. She told me more about her mother's family as the weeks went on. Her grandmother on the Cheyenne side had known horses in a way that went past technique, she said. You could put a horse in front of her that nobody had been able to work, a horse that had been mishandled or hurt, and the grandmother would just stand near it for a while before she did anything. Just let the animal know she was there. Louisa said she'd watched that as a girl and spent her whole adult life trying to understand what it was her grandmother was doing, and she still couldn't fully explain it. It wasn't patience exactly, she said. It was more like she already knew the horse was going to be all right, and she just needed the horse to figure that out too. I thought about that for a long time after. One evening toward the end of March, it had been dark for an hour, and we'd finished a game of cribbage, and I'd won by a narrow margin. She contested for about 3 minutes before conceding. She stood up to go. I walked her out to her truck the way I'd gotten into the habit of doing. She stopped at the truck door and looked at the sky for a moment, which was clear and cold and showing everything. Then she turned around and said, I'm glad I ended up here, Harlan. My name, first time she'd used it. She'd been calling me Mr. Briggs since October, which I'd assumed was her way, and then just like that she switched, and I wasn't ready for it. I said, so am I. She got in the truck and backed out of the yard. I stood there in the cold for a while, looking at where the taillights had gone. April, her son, came. He arrived on a Sunday morning in a truck he'd borrowed from his father, and he got out of it with his father's height and his grandmother's coloring and an expression that was doing a lot of work trying to look unconcerned. 16 is a hard age to be anywhere new, and he'd been new in too many places. He had his mother's eyes, dark and direct, and he used them to take in the Harker property, his mother's property now, with a carefulness that I recognized as someone checking whether this one was worth the trouble of caring about. Louisa brought him over the next afternoon. She said she'd been telling him about the ranch and thought he might want to see it. I think the truth was she wanted him to meet me, and for that to go well, and she'd figured the best setting for it was work. We shook hands. He was polite but unperformed about it, which I took as a good sign. I showed him around the east section, where I'd done the fence repair I'd figured out from Lewis's drainage advice. I pointed out the grade problem and what I'd done about it, and how the posts had held through the winter because of it. He nodded and asked me how I'd figured out the grade was the issue. I told him. He said that made sense. We walked the whole east section and he asked good questions. Not the questions someone asks to seem interested, the questions someone asks because they actually want to know. How did I manage the grazing rotation? Did I run any hay operation or buy all my feed? What did I think of the new fence post driving equipment he'd seen in a magazine? I told him the equipment was overpriced for what it did. He laughed. First time I'd heard him do that. After we ate supper at Lewis's, she'd made lamb with the ribs because she said Marcus liked it, and biscuits on the side, and there was an energy at the table that was different from our usual evenings, tighter and more careful. The way a room feels when someone is testing the floor before they put their weight on it. Marcus talked to me more than to her through dinner, which I thought was probably deliberate on his part, some teenage triangulation. But by the end of the meal he'd loosened some and was talking to both of us, and there was a moment where he said something. I can't even remember what now, something about a horse in Wyoming he'd particularly liked. And Louisa laughed, sudden and loud, the same surprised laugh I'd heard from her before but louder, and Marcus looked at her and something in his face relaxed. That was the thing I saw. That was what she was hoping for him to see her here in a place that fit her, laughing at something he'd said, for him to see that she was all right. Marcus stayed 2 weeks. He worked alongside me for most of it, which I hadn't asked for but didn't refuse. He was useful. He'd grown up in working environments and he wasn't performative about effort. He just did what needed doing. By the end of the first week, he and Dav had gotten comfortable with each other in the way young men and older working men sometimes do, built on very little talk and a lot of shared labor. On his second-to-last evening he asked me, not looking at me while he asked it, whether I thought his mother was going to stay. I thought about that. I said I think so, I think she means to. He was quiet for a while. We were cleaning up after working a section of fence, putting tools back in the bed of my truck. He said, she said that before. I said, I know she has. He said, do you think this time is different? I thought about October, about the way she'd looked at her deed and come over because she needed to know where the boundary sat and do it right. About the way she'd arranged her kitchen, about what she'd said in February about this being the last time. I said, yeah, I think this time is different. He looked at me for a moment, assessing that. Then he nodded, like he'd made a note of it and picked up the post driver. He left on a Sunday and hugged his mother longer than I expected, longer than the casual kind, and she held on. I was over by the truck, and I looked away to give them that. After he drove out, she came and stood next to me and watched where he'd gone, and I didn't say anything and she didn't either. May came in cold. I lost a cow the first week of it. Old girl, good producer, but she'd been struggling for 2 seasons and this pregnancy pushed her past what she had left. Hard birth in the middle of the night, calf in a bad position, and I worked 2 hours with Dov by lantern light trying to help, and it wasn't enough. The calf made it. Barely, and it was a near thing, and it needed round-the-clock watching for the first few days. The cow didn't. I sat in the barn afterward for a while. Not sentimental about it, cattle die, that's the nature of it. But there's something about losing an old animal in the middle of the night when you've been out there fighting for her that puts a particular weight on you. It takes something. I'd been up since before 2 in the morning. When Dov came in at 6, I went inside and I sat at the kitchen table and put my head down on my arms. Not sleeping, just not moving for a while. I heard the door sometime later. The particular sound of it, the way the latch catches when Louisa opens it. She came in and saw me, and she didn't exclaim or make a fuss. She just put the kettle on and sat across from me. I told her about the cow. She asked about the calf. I told her about the calf. She asked what the chances were. I said if it held through the week, probably good. If it didn't hold through the next 48 hours, probably not. She nodded. We sat there for a while, the kettle built. Then she said, "When did you last sleep?" I thought about it. Night before last properly. Yesterday was just pieces. She said, "Go lie down. I'll be here when you wake up." It was the way she said it. I've tried to explain this to myself afterward, and I still can't get it exactly right. She didn't say it to comfort me. She didn't say it gently. She said it the way she'd say the grade is causing pooling or the survey stakes are wrong. A fact about the situation that I might find useful. I'll be here when you wake up. Something about the plain certainty of it. I got up and went to the bedroom and slept for 4 hours. When I came out, she was at my table reading. She'd found a 3-month-old copy of some livestock management publication I'd never finished, and there was soup on the stove. She'd found things in my refrigerator I'd forgotten I had and made something out of them. I sat down and ate, and she read, and after a while she said, without looking up, "How's the calf doing?" I said I needed to go check. She closed the magazine, and we went out to the barn together. The calf held, made it through that first week, and then through May, and by June was becoming a thing, slow-moving and knock-kneed but alive and growing. Dov started calling him Lucky, which I said was a foolish name for a steer, and he said, "What's the better option?" and I didn't have one. June came. The 9th of June is a date I manage. I don't make a ceremony of it, and I don't ignore it. It's Claire's birthday, and she would have been 29 this year, and I get through the day the way you get through days that have a weight to them. You do the work and you don't stand still too long. I've been out checking on Lucky, that being what we were calling him now, apparently, and I came back across the yard, and I was thinking about Claire the way I think about her on that day, in pieces, her voice and her laugh and the way she'd call me on a Sunday just to check in, not because anything had happened, just to call. She'd done that every Sunday from when she moved to Flagstaff until she died. I still sometimes have a moment on Sunday mornings where I expect the phone. I was thinking about the cake. Applesauce cake. That was what Nora had made every year, starting when Claire was old enough to care about her birthday cake, and Claire had liked it better than any other kind. Brown sugar in the batter, a simple glaze on top. Nothing fancy, nothing that required equipment we didn't have, but every year that was what she asked for, and every year that was what she got. After Nora passed, Claire and I made it together. We weren't much as a team in the kitchen. Claire was functional but not enthusiastic about cooking, and I was functional at best myself, but we could make that cake. The recipe was on a note card in Nora's handwriting in the recipe box on the counter. The last time I'd made it was the Christmas before Claire died, when she'd driven out and we'd been here for 4 days, and on the second day we'd made the cake because she'd missed it, and it was only her birthday by 5 months in either direction. We figured. We'd made a mess of the kitchen and eaten it warm out of the pan, and there was an argument at some point about what counted as a full slice, and I don't remember who won. After she died, I put the recipe box in the pantry. I'd not opened it since. That's what I was thinking about when I came in the door. The smell hit me before I got the door all the way open. Brown sugar and the warm char of a pan going a minute too long, the particular smell of something baking that is just on the edge of too much. My legs stopped. Louisa was at my stove. She didn't turn around. She said, "Close the door, Mr. Briggs, you're letting the warmth out." I closed the door. I stood there with my hat in my hand, and I looked at her, and she had the dish towel in her waistband, and she had Nora's wooden spoon in her hand. The one with the crack up the handle that I'd put in the drawer 4 years ago, and the kitchen smelled like the 9th of June for the first time since Claire was alive. She looked at me over her shoulder, said, "Sit." I sat. She brought the cake to the table. Round pan turned out onto a plate, the glaze slightly thicker than Nora's. She'd had to guess at the recipe. She told me that later, not then. Then she just put the cake on the table and cut 2 pieces and put one in front of me and sat down and picked up her fork. She hadn't found the recipe box. She'd pieced it together from things I'd said in passing, over months of conversation, things I probably hadn't realized I'd said. I must have mentioned applesauce cake at some point, and she'd stored it somewhere and come over in the morning while I was out checking on Lucky and gone to work. She sat across from me, and she ate her piece. I sat there looking at mine. There was more cinnamon than Nora used. I could tell that right away. And the glaze was thicker, like I said, more of it, which meant it pooled toward the edge of the slice. It was close, though. Closer than it had any right to be, built from fragments and guesswork. I picked up my fork and I took a bite. Something in me just cracked. I've tried to find a better word for it and I can't. Not broke. Cracked, the way hard ground cracks when a thaw finally reaches down into it. Something sealed getting air into it for the first time in a long time. My eyes went. I couldn't stop it once it started. I put my fork down and pressed the heels of my hands against my eyes. I'm 63 years old and I've cried maybe 5 times in my adult life that I can remember, and I am not a man who does it in front of people, and I was not going to do it at my own kitchen table with my neighbor sitting across from me, and then I was doing exactly that. Not loud. Just the kind you can't get back once it comes. Louisa didn't move around the table. She didn't say anything. She reached across and put her hand on top of mine where it was on the table. Her hand was warm from the stove. We sat like that. After a while, the pressure in my chest let up some. She said quietly, "Tell me about her." So I did. I talked for a long time. About Claire at 6 years old wanting to ride and being furious that she couldn't get it right on the first attempt and going straight back to try again. The exact expression on her face. The set jaw. The absolute refusal to make it anyone's problem but her own. About her doing her homework at this table with the radio on loud, always louder than necessary, and how I'd learned to stop asking her to turn it down because she turned it back up within 5 minutes every time without realizing she'd done it. About how she'd call me every Sunday. Just to call. She never had a reason, never needed a reason. "Just checking in, Dad," she'd say, and we'd talk for 20 minutes about nothing in particular, and I didn't know until those calls stopped how much of my week I'd been building around them. About the way she laughed, which was louder than you'd expect from a woman her size and which she'd gotten from Nora. The exact same laugh. You could close your eyes and not know which one. About the last Christmas. The cake. The argument about what constituted a full slice and whether the end piece was its own category. The way she'd slept on the couch the last night because she'd stayed too late watching old movies and didn't feel like making up the guest room. And I'd come downstairs in the morning and found her there with her hair everywhere and her boots still on, and I'd stood looking at her and thought, there it is. There's my person, sleeping on my couch with her boots on. About the hug in the yard when she left, the extra second she held on. Louisa asked questions, not shaped questions, not pointed questions, just, where did she grow up? What did she want to do before? What was she like when she was angry? She was asking because she wanted to know who Claire was, not because she was building to a point. At some point, I noticed I'd eaten most of the piece of cake. I said I haven't talked about her like this and I couldn't finish the sentence because I didn't know how to say how long. Years. It had been years. Louisa said, "She sounds like someone worth knowing." "She was," I said, "she really was." That's a simple thing. It's only a sentence, but something about hearing it said back to me out loud by another person who'd listened long enough to mean it. It was different from carrying it around inside my own head, where it just sounds like absence. Hearing Louisa say it, it meant something else. It meant, I see that she existed and she was real and she mattered, and you were the man who knew her best and raised her and carried her forward. I sat with that for a while. Later she washed up the dishes and I dried them, which is my habit, and we worked together at the sink without talking much. The kitchen was warm from the oven, and the light was the late afternoon kind that turns everything amber and ordinary, and I was wrung out in a way that felt like relief more than exhaustion. The kind of empty that comes from putting something down after you've carried it a long time without noticing. She took her jacket off the chair by the door. I walked her out the way I always did. At the truck she stopped and turned, and she looked at me the way she sometimes did, steady, without asking me to do anything about it, and then she stepped forward and put both arms around me and held on. A real hold, not a careful one. Her head was against my jaw and her arms were tight, and she smelled like cinnamon and wood smoke and the outside, the particular smell of the afternoon air on her. I put my arms around her and held on back. We stood there in the yard in the late light for a while, long enough that a hawk cut across above us and was gone south, long enough that the temperature dropped another notch and I could feel it on the back of my neck. I didn't move and she didn't either. When she let go, she stepped back and looked at me. She said, "I'm not going anywhere, Harlan." Same way she'd said, "I'll be here when you wake up." Not comfort, fact. I nodded. My voice wasn't reliable. She got in the truck and drove out. I stayed in the yard after the taillights went. The sky was still light in the west, that last pale strip before dark, and the land was quiet and the air smelled like cold coming. I stood there for a while because I didn't feel like going inside yet, and I didn't know what I was waiting for, and I didn't need to know. That was June. We're in October now, a year around from when she first came over to settle the fence line. I want to tell you about the summer, because it went differently than any summer I've had in years. July was warm and the grass was good and the cattle were doing well. Dov and I had a stretch of particularly long days, and at the end of them, Louisa would sometimes come over or I'd go to her, and we'd sit on the porch and not say much. One evening in early July, Dov stayed late to help me renail a section of roof on the equipment shed that had been lifting in the wind. And something happened while we were up on that roof. Dov said something. I can't even remember what now. Something about the nails being the wrong gauge for the job. Something dry and obvious that for whatever reason struck me just right, and I laughed. Just laughed out of nowhere, loud and actual. Dov looked over at me and I shook my head because I couldn't explain it, and he went back to his nails with the beginning of a grin on him. We didn't talk about it. But I stood there on that roof for a second afterward, aware of it, aware of something that was still present in me that I hadn't known was there. August, Marcus came back for 3 weeks. He was different from April, less guarded, not dramatically, just incrementally, the way a place feels different when you've been to it before. He came over on his own a few times to help with work without being asked, which I took as a good sign. He and Dov had picked up roughly where they'd left off. One afternoon, the three of us spent about 4 hours running a section of new fence on the north draw where the rot had spread, and we worked well together, all three of us, nobody getting in anybody's way. The kind of shared effort that doesn't require coordination because everybody just reads the situation. In the evening, Louisa made supper for all of us at her place, and afterward Marcus helped clear the table, which she noticed without commenting on, and I could see that she was filing it away. All the small evidences that he was going to be all right. That night after Marcus had gone to bed, Louisa and I sat on her porch for a while. It was one of those August nights that's warm even past 10, the air holding onto the day's heat, and the sky was busy with stars the way it gets out here when there's no moon. We didn't talk much. She had her feet up on the rail and her coffee, and she was looking at the sky. After a while she said, "Thank you for what you said to him, in April." I said I didn't know what she meant. She said, "He told me. What you said about whether you thought I'd stay this time." I hadn't thought she knew about that. I hadn't told her. She said it mattered to him, coming from someone else, someone who wasn't me. I thought about that, about the particular weight a thing has when it comes from outside the family, from someone with no stake in the answer except that it be honest. I said I'd meant it when I said it. She said, "I know." We sat there for a while more. The cattle were quiet out in the dark, just the occasional low sound from the direction of the pen. Somewhere far off a coyote went and then nothing. She said, "I've been on my own with him a long time." I said I could tell. She said it's different now, having someone else around. Someone he respects. She said it matter-of-factly, looking at the sky, but I held on to it for a long time after. Someone he respects. She was talking about Marcus, but it was also something else, something about what she'd found here that she hadn't expected to find, and I think we both knew it. Before he left he came and found me in the barn. He said he'd been thinking, and he thought he wanted to come out more, not just the big visits, maybe just weekends sometimes. I said I thought that sounded good. He said, kind of looking at the wall, "I think she's happy here." I said, "I think she is." He looked at me then. He said, "Take care of her, would you?" He said it straight, not embarrassed about it, the way his mother said things, direct and without ceremony. I said I'd do my best. He left the next morning, and this time there was less of that held-breath quality to the goodbye. He hugged her and said he'd be out in a couple of weeks, and he was. September the work eased some, and Louisa and I fell into a pattern that had been building all summer, but which September made plain. Most evenings, one of us at the other's place. Cooking, mostly at hers because she was better at it, and we both knew it, and neither of us saw any reason to pretend otherwise. Talking about the day the way people do when the day is something they share between them. She'd tell me about the cattle she was building her herd around, a small Angus operation, careful and specific. She wasn't going to overextend herself the way she had in Wyoming. I'd tell her about what I was working on, the maintenance items, the things I was planning for next spring. It was ordinary. That's the thing I want to say. It was exactly as ordinary as what I'd lost, which is to say it was everything. There was an evening in September. The light was still going until almost 8, those last long evenings, where we were sitting on my porch and she'd brought her coffee and I had mine, and neither of us had said anything for maybe 20 minutes, and the land was doing what it does at that hour, going gold and then copper and then something darker, and the cattle were coming in toward the water on their own, and the windmill was turning slow in whatever was left of the afternoon air, and I thought, this is it. This is what I thought was finished. Not something spectacular, not a second act with trumpets, just a person I want to sit with when the day is done, and who wants to sit with me, and both of us knowing it without having to make a speech about it. I reached over and put my hand on hers, where it was resting on the arm of her chair. She turned her hand over and held mine. We sat like that until dark. It's October now. The morning light is coming in low and particular the way it does this time of year, cutting sideways across the kitchen floor, and there's a cake cooling on the counter. She made it this morning, before I was properly up. I heard her moving in the kitchen, and I lay there for a while just listening to that. The sounds of someone moving in your kitchen when you're still in bed, the particular domestic quality of it, which I had not had in my house in a long time. The recipe is closer now. She asked me more questions through the summer, and I told her what I remembered: how much applesauce, what kind, how my mother-in-law had always used the unsweetened kind so the sugar in the batter wasn't fighting anything. The glaze is still a little thicker than Nora's, but neither of us is inclined to change it because it's become its own thing. Not Nora's version, not the original, ours. I came downstairs and she was at the stove and the cake was already cooling, and she said, "There's coffee." And I poured a cup and stood there in my own kitchen with the morning light on the floor and the smell of brown sugar in the air, and felt the weight of what a year can do. 4 years ago, I was a man who'd put a wooden spoon in a drawer because he couldn't look at it, who ate cold food out of containers because cooking for one had no logic to it, who ran a ranch and knew the land and kept the operation sound and had done what was required of him for long enough that he'd forgotten it was possible to want more than what was required. I didn't know I was cold. That's the part I keep coming back to. A man can convince himself he's only what remains after the warmth goes, that the rest of it was just the luck of a particular season, and that season's over, and this is just how it is now. He can run a ranch and keep his fences and eat his cold food and believe that he is all right. He needs someone to show him otherwise. She didn't try to fix me. She didn't arrive with a plan or a project or some idea about what I needed. She came over about a fence line and borrowed a come-along and knocked on my door in December because her water line was frozen, and sat across from me at a lunch counter in January and talked about drainage and hay prices. She showed up in the plain way she did everything, because there was something useful to be done, and she just kept showing up, and somewhere in the accumulation of it, I started to thaw without knowing I was thawing. She saw something worth seeing. That's the thing. She didn't save me the way you save a man who's drowning with a rope thrown from a distance. She saved me the way you thaw a frozen line patiently from the inside until the thing that was locked up starts moving again. She's in the yard right now. I can see her through the window over the sink, standing at the fence rail with her coffee, looking out at the range. She does that most mornings, reads the land the way her grandmother read horses, not checking on anything specific, just being present to it, letting it tell her what it's got to say. Marcus is coming for Thanksgiving. He called last week and asked his mother, and she told me his voice was different when he asked, not careful the way it had been, just asking, like a boy asking about a place where he'd like to go. I've got things to do today. The hay delivery is coming before noon, and I need to talk to Dov about the cattle rotation, and there's a stretch of fence on the west side I've been putting off. Ordinary work, the kind that fills a day. But right now I'm standing in my kitchen with a cup of coffee and a cake cooling on the counter and that woman in my yard in the morning light, and I'm not in any hurry. A man can spend years not knowing what he's missing. He can be adequate and functional and sufficient and think that's the whole of it. Then someone comes over about a fence line and borrows a wooden spoon and bakes a cake from memory because she remembered what day it was, and he sits down at his own kitchen table and realizes he'd forgotten what it felt like to be somebody's person. I hadn't laughed in 4 years. I'm not that man right now. And that is entirely because of her, because she is who she is, and because she kept coming back to a worn-out rancher who'd convinced himself he was finished, and because she looked at him steady and long enough to see what was still worth choosing. She's coming back in from the yard now. I can hear her boots on the porch. I've got nothing poetic to say about what's about to happen. She's going to come in and pour herself more coffee and tell me something about the range conditions based on what she just saw out there. I'm going to tell her about the hay delivery. We'll eat the cake at some point today because that's what you do with a cake. It's a Tuesday morning in October on a ranch in the middle of nowhere, and I am exactly where I am supposed to be, and I know it and she knows it, and we don't need to say it. That's the whole of it. That's everything.